Buildings remember things people forget. Bowling alleys remember in wood. And the exact path the ball takes down 60 feet of lane, whether anyone's watching closely enough to notice. Wallace Prentice has spent 26 years learning to read that path inside Starlite Lanes, a 24-lane bowling center that opened in 1963. Its original wood lane surfaces still running beneath decades of resurfacing and the modern synthetic overlays installed on select lanes over the years. He was 60 now, lane maintenance mechanic, responsible for the oil and machines, the pin setters, and the exacting science of keeping 24 lanes performing identically for lead bowlers who notice the smallest inconsistency the way musicians notice a sour note. He had learned that exactness from a man named Roland Achebe, who had kept Starlight's lanes for 23 years before him, and who believed, without needing to argue the point, that a lane which played differently from its neighbors was quietly reporting something about the wood beneath the finish, not the oil sitting on top of it. Wallace started at Starlight at 34, hired as Achebe's assistant during a stretch, when lead play was expanding fast enough that the house needed someone else who understood oiling patterns the way Achebe did. Achebe was 61 then, precise and unhurried, a man who could watch a single test roll and tell you which lane it came from without looking at the number painted at the foul line. Oil sits on top of the wood, Achebe told him during Wallace's first week, the two of them standing at the approach of an empty lane before opening. It's a variable you control, but the wood underneath, the actual boards, the actual bed this whole house was built on, that's a variable that controls you, whether you admit it or not. If a lane hook's different from its neighbors and the oil's identical, you're not looking at an oiling problem. You're looking at the house telling you something about itself. Achebe kept lane pattern logs, precise records of oil application and ball reaction testing on every lane, taken with a standardized test ball, rolled the same way, down the same path, every single testing cycle. He believed the lane's true character lived underneath the finish, and somebody needed to be measuring it honestly rather than just oiling over whatever it did. Wallace remembered the first time Achebe let him run the standardized test alone, watching from a few lanes over rather than correcting his form the way he usually did. Afterward, Wallace had asked why the test ball mattered so much when lead bowlers all rolled their own balls anyway, each one drilled and weighted differently. Achebe had considered the question for a moment before answering, the way he considered everything. Because everybody's ball is different, he'd said. The test ball is the only thing in this house that's always exactly the same. If it hooks different on one lane than the others, that difference belongs to the lane, not the ball. Take away every other variable, and whatever's left is the truth. When Achebe retired, he left Wallace the logs, along with a piece of advice Wallace had carried for 26 years since. Test with the same ball, the same way every time. If a lane keeps steering it somewhere the others don't, the wood's telling you something. Don't argue with the wood. Starlight Lanes have been built in the confident, optimistic style of 1963. 24 lanes of maple and pine construction running the length of the low, wide building, automatic pin setters installed from the start. The whole house designed for the post-war boom in lead bowling that filled its lanes 6 nights a week for decades. Over the years, ownership had resurfaced portions of the original wood and, more recently, installed modern synthetic overlays on the house's highest traffic lanes, leaving a patchwork of eras beneath the same painted approach markings. Wallace knew the house the way he knew his own bowling ball. He knew which pin set on Lane 9 needed its sweet bar adjusted before every weekend tournament. He knew the particular echo the ball return made on Lane 3, slightly different from every other lane, a quirk nobody had ever bothered fixing because it never affected play. He knew the smell of fresh lane oil and old varnish that lived permanently in the house no matter how the ventilation ran. And he knew, better than anyone alive, that Lane 14 had always produced more hook, more leftward ball deflection, than any other lane in the house. It wasn't dramatic. Casual bowlers never noticed anything unusual about Lane 14. But serious league players, the kind who kept their own averages down to the decimal and noticed a lane's personality, the way a driver notices a car pulling slightly to one side, had quietly learned over the decades that Lane 14 played a little differently, and some of them requested other lanes for important games without ever fully articulating why. One long-time league captain, a woman who bowled at Starlight for over 30 years, had once told Wallace She simply didn't trust lane 14 for a tournament game, the same way you might not trust a particular pair of dice without being able to prove anything was wrong with them. Wallace had smiled and nodded at the time, filing her comment away the same way he filed every other small piece of evidence nobody else seemed to be collecting. Achebe's earliest entry describing it, from 1979, read, Asterisk lane 14 hooking early again. Same test ball. Same oil pattern as 12, 13, 15, 16. Oil machine calibrated. Nozzle checked. Something under that would is steering the ball before the oil even matters. Watching it. Asterisk. Wallace had read that entry during his first winter with the logs, sitting in the small maintenance office off the pin setter room, and had felt something settle into place that he wouldn't fully understand for years. Achebe had noticed something real. Achebe had never solved it. And Achebe had kept testing anyway. Cycle after cycle, patient enough to record a pattern he never got to finish explaining. Wallace continued the monthly testing without ever being asked to. Same test ball, same oiling pattern, same measured hook on lane 14 that its neighbors never produced. He noted it the way Achebe had, plainly, in the same logs. The pattern held. Month after month, year after year. In his 11th year with the logs, Wallace began recording something Achebe's descriptive notes had never quite captured with enough precision. The exact deflection distance of the test ball and boards, the standard measurement bowlers use to describe a ball's leftward or rightward drift, rather than simply confirming lane 14 hooked more than its neighbors. It took him nearly a decade of those precise readings to see what Achebe's rougher notes could only imply. The hook wasn't holding steady. It was increasing, a fraction of a board more each year, slowly enough that any single month's test looked unremarkable, unmistakable once laid out across 10 years of careful figures. And it held true regardless of anything Wallace changed on the surface. The same oil pattern, the same resurfacing cycles, and eventually the same modern synthetic overlay installed on top of the original wood, once ownership finally approved that upgrade for lane 14 along with several others. He sat with that realization one evening in the maintenance office. Achebe's oldest log open beside his own decade of deflection figures, the house quiet around him after closing, the automatic pin setters silent for the night, down the long row of empty lanes. 2 men, 1 lane. Over 30 years of the same patient question, neither of them ever quite ready to call it solved, and neither of them ever willing to stop measuring it either. The synthetic overlay should have erased whatever was happening beneath the original 1963 would entirely. A modern surface, uniform, consistent, laid directly over the old lane bed. And still, lane 14 hooked more than its neighbors, worsening at almost exactly the rate his number predicted, as though the overlay itself had learned the same lesson the old would have been teaching for decades. He thought about every league night the house had hosted since 1963. Every bowler who had ever stepped onto that approach and felt something faintly off without ever having a name for it, an entire community's collective intuition quietly agreeing with 2 mechanics' decades of careful measurement. He wrote a new entry beneath Achebe's oldest one, in the same plain hand, asterisk 10 years of deflection, figures confirm lane 14's hook is not stable. It is increasing, slowly, consistently, persists through resurfacing and the new synthetic overlay. 'Cause still unknown. Continuing to test. Asterisk. He underlined continuing. It felt like the only honest word available to him. Wallace had a theory in his 15th year that the cause might simply be the original wood's grain pattern, an inherent quirk in how lane 14 specific boards had been milled and laid back in 1963, a natural characteristic that no amount of surface treatment could ever fully mask. He spent the better part of summer studying the grain patterns visible on exposed sections of lane bed during a resurfacing project, comparing with samples from lane 14 against its neighbors, convinced he had finally found an explanation simple enough to accept and move past. The grain samples showed no meaningful difference. Lane 14's would match its neighbors in species, cut and lay almost exactly. Whatever was steering the ball wasn't a quirk in the timber itself. It was something happening beneath the boards entirely, in the substructure the whole lane rested on. He had been wrong. He wrote it plainly in the logs, in the same unembellished style Achebe had taught it without ever meaning to teach a lesson. Asterisk with grain theory, ruled out. Samples match neighboring lanes closely. The cause is not the timber. It is beneath it. Back to unexplained. Asterisk. It bothered him more than most of his wrong guesses did. He had wanted the grain to be the answer. Natural, explainable, the kind of finding that let a person close a question instead of continuing to carry forward another decade. Being wrong meant the cause lived somewhere beneath the entire lane bed. In the original 1963 substructure nobody had opened since the house was built. The full lane bed replacement announcement arrived in his 22nd year. Starlite's ownership approved a major renovation, removing the aging wood substrate across the house entirely and installing modern synthetic panels bolted directly to the original 1963 floor joist beneath, without individually inspecting each lane's joist condition before installation. The project treated the substructure as a single uniform foundation, exactly as the original construction drawings described it. Wallace read the project brief and felt an old unease sharpen. If something in the joist beneath Lane 14 had been quietly warping for over 40 years, new rigid synthetic panels bolted directly onto that same substructure, assuming uniform condition throughout, were about to be mounted onto the one section of foundation that had never actually matched its neighbors. He brought Achebe's logs, along with his own decade of precise deflection figures, to the lane replacement contractor. The contractor, a capable and straightforward man named Foster Calloway, reviewed the original 1963 substructure drawings against Wallace's data at a folding table set up near the pin setters. Lane 14's joist spacing and species match every other lane on this drawing exactly, Calloway said, tracing the schematic with one finger. If there were a real substructure issue, I'd expect it to show up somewhere in the original specifications. And it doesn't. My honest read is this is a minor, harmless quirk of the original wood, irrelevant once the synthetic panel system replaces the surface entirely and removes the variable altogether. I already ruled out the wood grain, Wallace said. Samples match. And the hook survived the last synthetic overlay you installed on that same lane, worsening at the same rate it always has. If a modern surface didn't fix it once already, a new one won't fix it this time either. Something onto that lane has been getting worse for over 40 years, and I don't think a flat drawing from 1963 tells you what's happening to it now. Calloway considered that, and to his credit, didn't dismiss it outright. I don't have another explanation for a trend like that, but a substructure drawing that matches every lane exactly doesn't give me grounds to individually inspect one lane's joist before a house-wide installation. The project scope is a uniform panel replacement, not lane-by-lane structure investigation without a documented cause. It was a reasonable position, and Wallace didn't have an engineering credential to argue against it. Well, it was over 40 years of a hook that had survived a full grain analysis and an entire synthetic overlay, and a growing conviction that a matching drawing from 1963 wasn't the same as confirming the actual joist still matched it today. Wallace didn't sleep well through the weeks that followed. He kept circling back to a question he couldn't put down. What if Calloway was right, and 40 years of careful testing amounted to nothing more than an old lane's harmless quirk, a pattern he and Achebe between them had slowly turned into a mystery through nothing but 2 careers of stubborn measurement? He had wanted, for years, for the worsening hook to mean something real. Wanting it to matter wasn't the same as it actually matching. He pulled Achebe's 1979 log out one more evening and reread the entry under the maintenance office's single desk lamp. Asterisk something under that would is steering the ball before the oil even matters. Watching it, asterisk. Achebe had never known the cause either. He had simply kept testing, cycle after cycle, trusting that the pattern was worth preserving even without an explanation attached. Wallace had inherited that trust without ever fully testing whether it could stand against a matching drawing and a reasonable contractor's project scope. He didn't have the cause confirmed. But not having it hadn't stopped Achebe from writing the first entry in 1979, and it wasn't a reason for Wallace to stop now. Not with new rigid panels about to be bolted onto Joyce's own decade of numbers said were still quietly warping. He requested, at his own initiative, a single day with a structural moisture specialist before the house-wide panel installation began. Not to delay the renovation. He made clear only to examine the joist beneath Lane 14 specifically, while the old wood surface was already scheduled for removal. The specialist was a woman named Priya Anand, who assessed wood frame structures for hidden moisture damage and long-term deformation. She reviewed Starlite's original 1963 construction drawings alongside Wallace's decade of deflection data, and she brought a moisture meter and a small borescope to examine the exposed joist beneath Lane 14 once the old surface was pulled up during the renovation's first phase. What she found explained over 40 years of hook that nobody had ever been able to name. There's a utility trench running directly beneath this section, Priya said, tracing the drawing against exposed joists with one finger. Main drain line for the building, installed close enough to the surface that the joist right above it had been sitting near a source of chronic condensation for 60 years, which swells with moisture and contracts as it dries, over and over, season after season. Do that unevenly, right along one narrow band of joists for 6 decades, and you get a very slow, very consistent crown building the lane bed above it. Not enough to see with your eyes, but more than enough to steer a rolling ball in one direction, a little more every year as the swelling and contraction cycle compounds. That's why the overlay didn't fix it, Wallace said. The overlay sits on top of the lane bed that was already subtly crowned, Priya said. A rigid modern surface doesn't correct a warp underneath it. It just transmits it faithfully, exactly the way the old wood did. Bolting new panels onto these same joists without addressing the moisture cycling would lock this same slow deformation impermanently under a surface advertised as perfectly flat. Wallace looked down at the exposed joists, ordinary lumber that had spent 6 decades quietly swelling and drying above a drain line nobody currently on staff had ever thought to trace. He thought about every test roll he and Achebe had ever recorded, decades of standardized measurements circling patiently around a cause neither of them could see, waiting for someone with the right tool to finally look underneath the boards themselves. Achebe called at the house telling you something, he said. I think he had the mechanism backwards. It wasn't the house talking. It was just water doing what water does for 60 years in the one place nobody ever had a reason check. Priya's findings went to Starlite's ownership within the week. Foster Calloway reviewed her moisture report and borescope footage personally and called Wallace afterward. You were right to push for this, Calloway said. The drawing told the truth about how the lane was built. It just never accounted for 60 years of a drain line sweating beneath one section of joists. If we bolted new panels onto that same substructure without finding this, we had built a permanently warped lane into the house's newest, most expensive surface, and probably spent years chasing a hook nobody could explain all over again. The renovation plan was revised. The joists beneath Lane 14 were dried, properly sealed against future moisture, and where necessary reinforced to correct the accumulated crown before any new synthetic panel went in. The rest of the house-wide replacement proceeded afterward, installed over a substructure that finally matched what the original 1963 drawings had always assumed it would be. Starlite Lanes filed a formal note in its facility's records, crediting both Roland Achebe's original 1979 observation and Wallace's 26 years of continued measurement as the reason a hidden structural warp had been found and corrected before a permanent modern surface locked it into the house for good. Wallace kept Achebe's logs. He added a final entry beneath the oldest one before moving the whole collection into Starlite's office archive. Asterisk Lane 14 joist dried, sealed, and corrected this year. Warp traced to 60 years of condensation from an underlying drain line, documented informally through ball deflection since 1979. First season on record with Lane 14 matching its neighbors. Roland, you were right. The wood was steering the ball the whole time. Neither of us knew why for a very long time. Asterisk. He rolled the standardized test ball down Lane 14 on a quiet morning after the new panels were installed, watching it track straight and true, matching the neighboring lanes almost exactly for the first time in the house's recorded history. He thought about Achebe, standing at the same approach decades earlier, telling a nervous new hire that oil was a variable you controlled, but that what underneath controlled you, whether you admitted it or not. Wallace had carried that sentence through 26 years, through a ruled-out wood grain theory, through a season of real doubt about whether 2 careers of careful testing had amounted to anything more than habit. He hadn't needed to understand the cause immediately. He had only needed to keep testing, the way Achebe had taught him, until it finally told him exactly what had been steering the ball for over 40 years.